Higgins is an important 20th century American painter who primarily worked in the first half of this century. His mature work shows his participation in the very important Taos School. I'm Barbara Cohenauer, your host for Focus on Art. This evening we'll be at Gilcrease Museum for a large retrospective show of Victor Higgins' watercolors, oils, and drawings. Let's take a look at the show. My guest for the evening is Joan Tricoli. Joan, welcome back to Focus on Art.
Thanks, Barbara.
Joan is the curator of art here at Gilcrease, and she will be taking us through the exhibit. So, Joan, where shall we begin?
Well, I think we should begin at the beginning.
Okay.
Our exhibition here at Gilcrease is Victor Higgins, an American master. It's the first serious retrospective exhibition that's been devoted to a painter of the Taos School, which, as we know, was founded in New Mexico in about 1914. Victor Higgins was a native of Indiana. We're looking here at a picture that he painted in the city of Chicago shortly after his studies at the Art Institute of Chicago. It shows the Nike of Samothrace, a famous classical sculpture which is installed in the Art Institute. Higgins was born and grew up on a farm, but he very early had a love of art, which his parents encouraged. And at the age of 15, he went to Chicago and began to study seriously. This is one of his first paintings done after he reached maturity as an artist. We have a few other works of his student years, Barbara, if we want to take a look at those together. In 1911, Higgins went to New York, which then as now was America's art capital, and he only spent a little while there. And the artists whom he met encouraged him to go to Europe for further study. And this painting, which is called Moorland Piper, is an example of the kind of work that he did while in Europe between 1911 and 1913. It's a kind of fantasy of the Cornish countryside, a place that's strongly associated with fairies and druids and other kinds of fantasy figures. It's a very imaginative picture. He also spent time in Munich, which attracted many American artists, particularly those who would later become leaders of the Taos School. These are some small drawings of other European cities. The picture I want to particularly draw your attention to is this one, which is called Canal in Bruges. Bruges, of course, is the Venice of Northern Europe. It's in Belgium. And it shows Higgins's Munich style fully developed. The Munich Academy taught a style which has been called Dark Impressionism, in which the artist was encouraged to use a loaded brush, a brush that had lots of paint on it, and paint freely, but also, unlike the French Impressionists, to use dark, somber colors. And of course, that's what's happening here. It's a very muted kind of color scheme.
Almost looks like a lot of Whistler.
Yeah, there is a really Whistlerian quality to it. It has that kind of abstract composition, that strange point of view, where the architecture is almost out of the frame, and the focus is on water and the abstract designs that one finds in water. One of the important things also about Higgins's period in Munich was that he met other future colleagues from Taos there, particularly Walter Ufer, whose influence we'll see a little later when we get to Taos. Now, by 1913, Higgins was back in Chicago, which really had become his hometown. And there he soon became a leader in artistic circles, and he was encouraged by the mayor. Chicago had one real art-loving mayor, whose name was Carter Harrison. And Carter Harrison had made a trip to Taos in 1914 and been bowled over by the landscape in New Mexico, and especially by the Pueblo at Taos. And he made a series of deals with various artists in the Taos Society to finance their trips to New Mexico in exchange for paintings. And he had done that with Higgins' friend Ufer, and a year later he proposed to do it with Higgins as well. And this painting, which dates from 1915 and is called Baking Bread, is one of the first of Higgins's Taos pictures. It dates from what's called his first Taos period, which lasted from 1915 to 1919. As you can see, remembering the canal in Bruges, the light in New Mexico, which is so brilliant, completely transformed his palette, and he moved to a style in which there's a great deal of strong color and a light flooded effect. He uses the same kind of brushwork, but his color scheme is totally different. Like most of the Taos artists, he was fascinated by the Pueblo. He considered this civilization of the Taos Indians to be the American original native ancient civilization. And he was very taken with the Indians and their lifestyle, which seemed to be in harmony with nature. They seemed to embody a lot of the qualities that Americans like us associate with being Americans, like self-reliance and individuality. But at the same time, they were very, or seemed so to these artists, to be very simple, elemental people who lived in perfect harmony with nature and with each other. He made a series of paintings of individual Indians, which I'd like to look at with you next.
All right. Joan, Indians are a major subject of the Taos painters, right?
They are indeed. In fact, as I was mentioning, that was one of the things that attracted artists to Taos in the first place. One of the interesting things about Higgins, who always stood a little bit apart from the group in his interests, is that his paintings of Indians are really not about Indians. He saw Indians as a pictorial motif rather than as a romanticized kind of noble savage theme. And so often you get pictures like this in which the subject is sitting in a very meditative pose, of kind of unguarded moment, and does not make any kind of eye contact with the viewer. Many of his sitters are in profile, as we see here, or three-quarter view, so that they're turned away from the viewer. These portraits are not psychologically penetrating, nor are they romanticized. They're really abstract compositions in many ways. One of the things that Higgins did, as all the Taos painters did, was to make a collection of various Indian artifacts and works of art. And so here we see a little bowl, and there's some fabric and these gourds and things, all of which he used to make a composition which is as much a still life as it is a portrait.
Okay. We just really see the effects of modern art.
Yes.
In the works of Victor
Indeed.
Hood.
Higgins is the most modernist of all the Taos painters, and as we continue through the exhibition, we'll see that more and more. But this interest in the painting first, above the subject, is a modernist one. One of the interesting little facets that are in the show are these small oil sketches, which are studies for portraits. This is one that's not in the show, but this little one here, it's very quickly and beautifully painted in a kind of tour de force style, is a study for this picture of an Indian man playing with a cat. Now, this picture also has a photograph which served as a study. When Higgins was involved in figure painting, he used photography a great deal. He wasn't a very patient guy, and the models had difficulty. Obviously, a pose like this one couldn't hold for long, if only because the cat would decide to leave. And so Higgins made photographs and then painted from them. That use of photography was also another way of distancing himself from the subject. When the real person wasn't there, it was even easier for Higgins to see the picture as an abstract arrangement of forms and colors on canvas, rather than an encounter with a real living, breathing individual. We have another picture in the show in which Higgins used a photograph as a preparatory work, and it happens to be one of his major figural works. This picture is called Fiesta Day. Higgins painted it around 1918. We have this great little photo panel that shows him putting the finishing touches on the picture. I mentioned that he used photography to make this, and his technique was to make a quick oil sketch, such as the one we saw for the picture of the Indian with a cat, and a photograph to set up his composition. And in fact, here's the oil sketch. And then he took that sketch and the photograph back to the studio and started to work on the big canvas. But then for the final finishing touches, he set up his figures back out in the full sunlight. Here, however, is the finished work. This painting, unfortunately, marks the beginning of the end of Higgins' popularity with collectors. As I mentioned long ago, he was a Chicagoan, and he had some success there before he moved to Taos. And even after moving to Taos, he still sold most of his pictures to people who were from Chicago. And this picture was shown in Chicago in 1918, where it won some prizes. But it also, believe it or not, it's hard to believe, was criticized for the anatomy was not considered to be quite right, the color was thought to be off, and it marked the beginning of the end of his popularity in his native city, and also the beginning of his turning away from the use of the Indian. I mentioned before that he was a friend of Ufer, and those of your viewers who are familiar with Walter Ufer's work will say, my goodness, that looks like one. And there was a certain period in his early Taos style when he was like a chameleon, and he picked up from all the other artists who worked there, and as we know, there were quite a few. And this is an example of that, and we will see one other one before we finish talking about Higgins as a figure painter. Barbara, this picture called Girl with Parrot and Hoop is really the last painting by Higgins in which the Indian is even remotely romanticized. This really marks the end of his career as a painter of Native Americans, and almost as a painter of figures from the New Mexican scene. There is also a painting in the show called The Widower, which shows a Hispanic American leading his sheep, which is very much influenced by Buck Dunton, another of the Taos painters. And that really, for Higgins, was the end as far as figure painting goes in a major way in Taos.
Well, Joan, what happened to his popularity?
Well, it started to decline, and part of it was his lack of interest in painting the figure after about 1923, because that was the most popular of the Taos Society's subjects. He turned more and more to landscape painting, which gave him a chance to be a more abstract painter. And that's what we'll be seeing more and more of as we go further through the show.
So the more contemporary it becomes, the less popular it becomes with collectors. Is that a fair assessment?
Unfortunately, that's true.
Okay, so the landscapes come next.
Yes, they do. Barbara, this is one of Victor Higgins's most important early landscapes. It dates from only about 1916 to 1917, so it's a little bit earlier than those Indian figure pieces that we were just looking at, but it points the way to the future in his style. Higgins became more and more interested in the landscape, and especially in the contrast of forms and forces that he found in nature. And in fact, in a picture like this is called Walking Rain or Pablita Passes. It has two titles. He introduces an element that we often find in his landscapes, which is a storm. Of course, New Mexico is famous for having that kind of panoramic landscape in which you can see 20 different weather systems going on at once. And that was something that Higgins incorporated as a compositional device and also as a dramatic device, so that the conflict in these pictures, in these landscapes, really comes from the collision of natural forms and forces rather than the conflict between people, which is what you find more usually in figure paintings. In fact, there never was much human conflict in Higgins' pictures to begin with, and gradually, as he developed as a landscape painter, he came to eliminate human figures more and more, and finally almost entirely, as we'll see if we go forward in his landscape work and look at a whole gallery full of landscapes that we have here, in which we can trace his development to maturity. The first picture I would like to show you is this one called Palo Duro Canyon, 1923. And it shows his earlier style, which basically has to do with simplifying the natural forms of the landscape, and it tends to be very curvilinear. He associated curving lines with Renaissance style, so this was his old style.
Okay, his old master look.
Yes.
Okay. One thing I noticed on the landscape that we just looked at, and this one, is that he is very painterly.
Yeah, yeah.
Beautiful handling of the paint as it lays on the surface of the canvas. Of course, we might look at this painterly style with the oil here and then compare it to the watercolors on either side.
Yeah, that brushwork, of course, was a legacy of his training at Munich. these watercolors, the one here and this one down here, which actually I prefer, so I'll come down and look at it with you, show him beginning to experiment in the medium. And as you can see, there's an almost sponge-like effect, which approximates the painterliness of oil in a much different medium, of course, watercolor, which is a very thin and essentially dry medium in terms of the surface that you get when you're done. Also notice the curvilinear forms, which are so strong in this. This is a picture of a mountain stream in winter, which was a favorite landscape subject of Higgins. However, this curvilinear style was not to last, as we see as we proceed down this wall. As you can see, he's becoming much more angular in his landscape style.
I have to ask you, had he had any contact with Marin at this point in his life?
Yes. John Marin, who is America's greatest watercolorist of the 20th century, visited Taos in 1929. In fact, he came with George O'Keeffe. Taos attracted not only permanent residents, such as Higgins, but also a whole group of transients, and Marin was one of them. And there's no question that he had a great influence on Victor Higgins. If we look at a picture, say like this one here, the mountain farm, we can see how Higgins adopts certain devices that are very familiar to those of us who know Marin's style, like the jagged forms used everywhere, the kind of cubist faceting he picked up from Marin. There's no question that there was influence, and that influence in his watercolor style passed over into his oil painting style. So that radical change which he made in watercolor then was absorbed into his oils. Notice how now we're looking at angular forms, sharp kind of diagonals and hard lines versus those curves that we saw earlier. Right. And this is what Higgins identified as modern art, angular, cubistic kinds of forms. Here we get another favorite device of Marin's, which is the internal framing. Notice how he uses, this is maybe a little rainstorm over here, and the clouds are used to create a frame within a frame for the image, which is something that Higgins also adopted from Marin. Well, Barbie, as you can see, we've started our docent training for the show, which we think will be very popular here in Tulsa. So things are happening at the museum today.
Looks like a busy day.
Yeah, it always is around here. Here are a couple more of those Marinesque watercolors showing how Higgins' style really didn't change too much once he met Marin. His use of the landscape continued to be as a kind of motif, a reason to show an abstract composition.
Joan, did he make enough money selling these paintings to support himself at this point in his life?
No, actually, he had a great deal of trouble, especially during the Depression, which is when these two watercolors were made. However, they also are documents of the one financially secure period in his life, which came between 1937 and 1940, when he was married to the San Antonio heiress Marion Kugler McNay, whose famous Spanish-style mansion is now a museum down in San Antonio. Right. And in fact, these are pictures of her garden here on the wall. I hung them in this part of the gallery with a number of still lifes, one of which is right here. This is an early still life of zinnias, which zinnias are one of the more popular flowers grown in Taos, as anyone knows who's visited there. This is an early still life which shows the continued influence of the painterly Munich style, which you observed in his landscape paintings as well. Still life was always an important subject for Higgins. It didn't move, so it gave him lots of time to carry out formal experimentation, which was really his interest as an artist. And as time went on, if we look at this much later still life called Marigolds, we can see how, again, the still life, like the landscape and the figure as well, is really a pretext for an abstract composition. He's very interested in contrasting forms and colors, different shapes, different kinds of lines. Higgins had a big collection of pots and of fabrics, too, so that he would make these wonderful compositions and then paint them. So still life was a way of experimentation for Higgins.
Well, he certainly is a contemporary of Georgia O'Keeffe, and I think you can see them almost moving together through the early contemporary art movement here in
Early
the
American
United
modernism, exactly. They both are very important figures in it.
States. All right, what do we have next?
Well, his final works.
Okay, and those are primarily landscapes?
Yes. The first one is this painting, which is called Winter Funeral and is considered by many people to be Higgins's masterpiece. It's a kind of culmination of all of his previous landscape work. It has everything. It's got those framing devices that he uses, a storm and the clouds. It's got his favorite motif of the winter stream. The picture is also probably one of the most moving paintings that he made. He was not an emotional painter. You don't get a big charge out of any of his works in the sense of feeling rather than an intellectual sense. But it does have to do with the death of his mother in 1931. It depicts an actual funeral in Taos, but it's believed that that funereal kind of gloom that descends over this landscape has to do with his feelings about his mother who died back in Indiana. And you can see this cold winter landscape where everything is dead, not just the person who is being laid to rest. There is a painting from Gilcrease Museum in this show.
Oh, okay.
Here it is. It's called The Horse Race. And it shows Higgins at his most developed as an abstract landscapist. As you can see, it has those cubistic qualities that he learned from Marin, and it's very powerfully structured. Higgins once said that painting a picture, or the painter's assignment is not so much to make a picture as it is to solve a problem. And it has that kind of analytical approach. This is Higgins' studio courtyard we see here, and he's abstracted it into a series of planes. All the architectural elements kind of lean up against each other, and he plays off these straight lines against the curving forms of the figure. The organic versus the architectural is a theme that we often see in his work. And the contrasts even extend to ones between different rates of speed. He's got a very slowly walking figure versus a group on horseback. And this actually is the only Higgins in our collection, believe it or not. We have a very large Taos Society collection, but this was a hole in the collection that was filled just a few years ago. So we're very happy that it has such a prominent place in the show.
Well, it's really one of the most lovely paintings in the show, Joan.
Oh, it's gorgeous.
Yes,
it's one of his most important works.
That I'm very impressed with this.
Yeah, it's a great thing to have here in Tulsa. Now, that sense of architecture that I was talking about in The Horse Race is something that, curiously enough, extends to his late figure paintings, of which this is an example. And we have further down on the wall 2 preparatory studies for this oil, one in watercolor and one in charcoal. I spoke earlier of how his Indian portraits feature figures who look away from the viewer. Now here we have someone who's totally got her back to the artist. It's a completely distance kind of view of the human figure in which the figure has been reduced to a pictorial motif. It's just an occasion for Higgins to study the way you can contrast curvilinear forms, the organic forms of the figure, with the angular decorative forms of these textiles that he uses as a kind of abstract frame for the figure.
It's amazing how he uses the same technique on the landscape that he does on the figure painting.
Yes, they're almost interchangeable. I mean, this could be a little cityscape here if you took away the figure. And his approach was like that. He approaches not the subject, but the composition. That's what really interests him, is making an effective abstract composition, no matter what the subject. His last works are called the Little Gems, which are these little oil paintings of New Mexican landscapes, which Higgins made actually from the trunk of his car. He drove around with a specially rigged up paint box, and he went to different sites in New Mexico and painted these little works. He made them for the tourist trade, But they are not insignificant little paintings, and in fact, in a way, they express better than any of his earlier work the pure joy that he got from using paint. So they were kind of an old age style for Higgins.
Well, I certainly think you can see that joy of painting in this little gem that's right here beside us. Well, Joan, I certainly appreciate your being with us for Focus on Art, as always. This is a wonderful show, an artist that I think leaves us with many things to go home and think about, as we have one of these kind of unusual American 20th century artists that move from traditional things into the more contemporary things. I appreciate being here, and thank you for sharing with us.
Thank you, Barbara.
For those of you at home, we appreciate your being with us as always. And until next time, this is your host, Barbara Cohenauer, wishing you a most pleasant good evening.